Beneath the red sky of Wyoming, a wounded rancher lay half dead on the prairie, his body broken, his heart colder than the night wind. He thought mercy had no place left in this world, until a young widow's daughter found him, her trembling hands daring to heal what life had shattered. She didn't know his past. She didn't know the weight of his sins. But in saving him, she was about to awaken something fierce and untamed love, born from ruin, strong enough to rewrite both their fates. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The wind howled low across the prairie, dragging whispers of winter through the brittle sagebrush as Elijah Raleigh crawled through the dirt like a man already buried. Blood oozed from the hole just beneath his ribs, soaking through the torn remnants of his duster, each heartbeat a dull thunder in his ears. He'd left a trail muddy, wet, reeking of gunpowder and regret that stretched back to where the ambush ended and the last man stopped moving. The sun dipped low behind the jagged ridges, setting fire to the sky with hues of scarlet and gold, as though the land itself mourned something lost. Elijah didn't cry out, didn't curse, didn't pray, just clenched his teeth and dragged his failing body across the dust toward a shallow creek bed he barely remembered seeing on the ride north. His revolver clattered from his hand empty, useless, spun once in the dirt and stopped. He didn't reach for it. Not anymore. His vision blurred, the sky splitting into doubles, then triples. The cold started in his fingertips, working its way inward, numbing what pain hadn't already dulled. He welcomed it. Dying alone out here didn't scare him. It felt right. Like the final page of a book written in ash and gun smoke. But just as the dark began to claim him, a soft flicker broke through the golden glow of a lantern bobbing gently against the wind. Footsteps crunched in the snow-dusted grass. Elijah blinked once, twice, eyes struggling to focus on the small silhouette moving toward him. At first, he thought it a ghost, some whisper from the other side come to finish him off. But then she knelt. Real, flesh and bone. A girl barefoot, dirt smudged on her hem, black hair braided tight over one shoulder. She held the lantern low, eyes narrowing at the sight of him. Her breath caught when she saw the gun, the blood, the rawness of his wound. She took a step back, uncertain. Elijah's hand didn't move. He could barely raise his head. "Leave me," he rasped though. The sound came out more like a groan. She didn't. Not right away. Her gaze swept over him, calculating, cautious, but not cruel. Slowly, she crouched beside him. Her fingers, trembling but deliberate, reached to touch his face, checking his pulse. "You're burning up," she murmured, half to herself. Then louder. "You'll die out here." He managed a weak chuckle. "That's the idea." Her brow furrowed. The lantern shifted, casting warm light across her face, young. Too young to carry the burden that already etched into her eyes. She couldn't have been more than 17, but her shoulders were square, and her voice held no tremble when she said, "Not tonight. You won't." She tucked the lantern into the crook of her arm, hoisted one of his arms over her slender frame, and heaved. Elijah grunted in pain. She didn't flinch, bit down hard and started dragging. Inch by inch, grit in her teeth, breath fogging in the cold air. He wanted to protest, to warn her who he was, what he'd done, but the words never came. Only silence. Only the crunch of frost under her bare feet. Somewhere behind them, the crows scattered into the sky. The cabin came into view just as Cora's legs buckled beneath Elijah's weight, a sagging structure of rotted beams and weather-worn shingles clinging stubbornly to the earth at the edge of the foothills, like a skeleton refusing to lie down. Smoke coughed weakly from the crooked chimney, and as she dragged him across the warped porch, the wind pushed against the door with a mournful creak. Inside, warmth clashed with the stench of ash, damp wool, and bitter herbs steeped in old jars that lined the shelves like sentinels of some forgotten apothecary. In the corner, beneath a faded quilt stitched with thistles and stars, lay Ada Cora's mother skin waxen, lips cracked, a wet rattle in her lungs that came every few breaths. She stirred as the door opened but didn't lift her head. Cora, jaw clenched, hauled Elijah onto a straw mattress beside the hearth and dropped him like deadweight. He groaned, half-conscious, reaching for the knife tucked in his boot, but she kicked it away, with one bare foot, calm as sunrise. "Try anything," she whispered, not looking at him. and I'll let you bleed out. No threat in her voice, just a promise. Flat and familiar, like someone reciting a recipe they'd used before. He didn't respond. His body was a furnace, sweat pouring off his temples, eyes rolling. She knelt, pulled a rusted basin from under the stove, and filled it with water gone tepid from the kettle. She cleaned the wound with rags that had once been white, wincing as he jerked under her touch. "Where's your man?" Elijah croaked between gritted teeth. "Buried him last spring," she answered without pause, tightening a strip of linen around his ribs. Snake bite. Or maybe he just ran too slow. He grunted, half in pain, half in laughter, but it caught in his throat. Figures. Ada coughed, long and hollow, like her body was trying to turn inside out. Cora glanced over, lips tight, then went back to work. The cabin said more than she ever did. Scars in the floorboards, a broken rocking chair held together with twine, the rifle mounted high above the fireplace but never out of reach. She'd seen worse than Elijah, lived worse. Maybe that's why she didn't ask questions, just worked. She sewed his wound with coarse thread, her fingers stained with blood and tincture oil. He drifted in and out, muttering things, names, places, apologies meant for ghosts. Cora didn't flinch when he called her by another woman's name, didn't react when he cursed the law, the land, or God himself. She simply packed dirt around the fire to keep it breathing and wrapped him in the old quilt with quiet care. That night, the storm rolled in, thunder rumbling like distant hoofbeats, and the walls shook with wind. Ada slept fitfully. Elijah's fever broke sometime before dawn, and when his eyes opened, she was already there, staring into the flames, a mug of bitter root tea clutched between her hands like it might turn her to stone if she let it go. He watched her in silence. She felt it. "I don't need your thanks," she said without turning. "I just don't bury strangers on Mondays." For the first time in years, Elijah didn't have a retort. He just watched the fire dance across her profile and wondered, faintly, what kind of life turns a child into stone? The fever came on like a wildfire, devouring Elijah from the inside out, dragging him into a world where past sins replayed in broken reels of sound and smoke. He saw a cabin much like this one, heard the sharp crack of pistols, the scream of a woman whose voice he still couldn't forget, the begging of a man on his knees, blood on the floorboards that no amount of scrubbing ever lifted, all flashing in and out between the pull of darkness and the burn in his side. And through it all, his left hand stayed locked around the small leather pouch he'd carried for years, the one thing he refused to lose even when death crouched at his shoulder. In one fragment of dream, a ring gleamed in a firelit room, a simple band, worn thin at the edges, still warm from another person's hand, and he tightened his fist, afraid it might slip away again, afraid of what it meant to remember. When morning came, he didn't feel it. He only stirred when cold air touched his ribs and a small, steady hand rolled him to his side. Cora worked in silence, peeling back the stained bandage, replacing it with clean cloths she'd boiled in water and camphor, her fingers neither gentle nor cruel, just determined. The way someone behaves when life has already taught them mercy is a luxury, not a duty. As she wrapped the fabric, her thumb brushed the inside of his palm, and she paused, eyes narrowing at the twisted scar burned into his flesh. Not a wound from a blade or a bullet, but a deliberate mark, seared deep long ago. Elijah jolted awake like a sprung trap, hand darting for where his gun should have been, muscles tense, breath ragged, eyes wild. Cora didn't move, didn't scream, didn't drop the bandage. She just looked at him, that same unblinking stare she'd had the night she found him, and said in a voice quiet enough to cut bone, "I ain't afraid of ghosts." For a moment, neither of them breathed. The storm outside rattled the shutters. Elijah's heartbeat thundered, in his ears. But she held his gaze, calm as a winter lake, then stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked out of the room without another word, leaving him alone with the firelight and the memory of a brand burned into skin for a reason no one had asked about in years. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, every crack in the wood above him turning into a face from his past, every echo in the cabin sounding like footsteps from a night he wished he'd died in. Her words kept circling back, not afraid of ghosts like she'd seen enough of them already to know they couldn't hurt her anymore. He flexed his hand, feeling the scar pulse under the bandage, remembering the heat of the iron, the smell of flesh, the oath that followed, the grave they swore to fill. That girl had no idea what kind of man she'd dragged into her home, but somehow, he feared her indifference more than her judgment. Pain fades, bullets heal or kill, but being seen, truly seen, was a different kind of wound, and he wasn't sure this one would ever stop bleeding. The days passed quiet as snowfall, each one blending into the next with a rhythm too fragile to name. And in that hushed world, Elijah watched from his mattress near the hearth as Cora moved through her strange, sorrow-stitched routines, chopping wood in the morning mist with a blade far too big for her thin arms, hauling water from the creek in dented pails, feeding the 2 goats with stale oats and soft whispers, pausing only to spoon medicine between her mother's cracked lips or hold her hair back while the coughing racked through her bones like thunder. Ada's breathing grew shallower by the hour, her body shrinking into the mattress like a soul trying to leave without making a sound. Elijah, body still bruised and breath still stiff with pain, began to regain fragments of strength, enough to prop himself up on one elbow, enough to curse under his breath when the fire burned too low. But Cora never offered sympathy, only actions, done with a kind of hardened grace that unsettled him more than any pistol ever had. By the 5th morning, driven by a surge of guilt or pride, he couldn't tell which he tried to leave. Dressed in borrowed boots and a coat stiff with old blood, he limped toward the open plains, heading west, toward the hills that promised distance and a cold grave if nothing else. Each step was agony, the wound in his side screaming against the frostbitten air, but he pressed on, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed. He made it nearly a mile before the pain collapsed him into the snow, his body crumpling like parchment in fire. He awoke hours later to the sharp pull of rough hands under his arms, Cora, dragging him back across the dirt, her face pale but unreadable, the same expression one might wear while dragging a sack of coal. "Dumbest fool I ever seen," she muttered once, not with anger, but weary certainty, and that was the end of it. That night, a storm rolled down from the mountains, thunder cracking over the cabin as rain lashed, the windows and wind screamed through the shutters. Elijah lay awake, teeth clenched against the dull throb in his ribs, and through the roar of the storm, he heard it barely audible, but unmistakable, the sound of someone crying. He sat up slowly, wincing, and traced the noise to the barn just beyond the back window. A single lantern glowed there, and inside, crouched between 2 bales of hay, was Cora, shoulders shaking, face buried in her arms. It was not the loud grief of children, or the bitter weeping of wives. It was quiet, strained, like something pulled from her in secret, as if even her sorrow had learned not to make a scene. Elijah gripped the edge of the window, then let go. He thought of going to her, thought of saying something, anything, but the words turned to ash before they reached his throat. Instead, he sank back against the wall, pulled the quilt tighter around his shoulders, and muttered to no one but himself, "You don't owe me a damn thing." And in that moment, he wasn't sure if he meant her or the world. The snow came early that year, soft as breath and twice as cold, blanketing the valley in a white that swallowed the sound from the world, leaving only the creak of tree limbs and the low moan of wind through the rafters. Elijah woke to stillness, an absence he could feel in his bones before he even opened his eyes. The fire had burned low, casting the room in long shadows, and across from him, the bed where Ada lay was empty of breath, her mouth slightly parted, eyes closed as if merely resting, but the weight was gone. The invisible gravity that clung to her in life now vanished. No last words, no final confession or whispered goodbyes, just silence. Cora stood over her mother's body, face unreadable, fingers tightening around the edges of the quilt she would not use to cover her. She didn't weep. Not then. Not when she pulled on her threadbare coat, lifted the old spade from beside the hearth, and walked into the pale morning light. Elijah, stiff with pain, dragged himself to the porch and watched from the splintered rocking chair as she crossed the field behind the cabin, her figure a dark slash against the snow, disappearing between the tall, white-dusted aspens that whispered like mourners. He didn't offer to help. He couldn't, not with his legs still weak and his pride heavier than his limbs, but even if he could have, there was something sacred in the solitude she chose, and he knew better than to trespass. Hours passed. Snow fell harder, coating the wood, the goats, the rusted water pump, until the world looked bleached of history. When Cora returned, her shoulders sagged under an invisible weight, eyes glassy but dry. Dirt streaked her sleeves, and blood a pinprick trail from where the spade had blistered. Her palms dripped from her fingers. Elijah held out his flask, the whiskey sloshing gently inside, but she didn't take it. She stared at it, then at him, and said, "You didn't know her." Not as an accusation, but as a stone-cold fact too heavy to argue with. Then she stepped past him and disappeared into the cabin without another word. He didn't drink from the flask either, just sat there, holding it between trembling fingers, listening to the wind scrape against the walls and the distant hush of snow settling on the grave he hadn't seen. That night, long after the lanterns had gone dim and Cora's footsteps ceased, Elijah hobbled to the barn, leaning hard on the doorframe for support, his breath fogging in the cold. There, in the corner where spare lumber leaned like forgotten memories, he found a plank of pine, splintered, gray, just wide enough. With numb fingers, he unsheathed his hunting knife and pressed the blade to the wood. He didn't speak, didn't think, just carved, slow and deliberate. Each letter a wound reopened. ADAM. Carved deep enough to last, shallow enough to speak only to those who looked close. He ran his fingers over the finished name, then set the plank against the wall, ready for when the ground thawed and a post could be driven in. In that moment, no one watched him, no one thanked him, and no one forgave him, but something in his chest shifted, just slightly, like an old door creaking open in a house long boarded up. It was a week to the day since Ada had passed, and the snow had hardened into a crusted white shell across the land, each footstep crunching like broken glass. Elijah had begun walking without the wall for support, limping slow with a carved cane Cora had whittled in silence, her knife moving with precision, as if shaping wood could silence grief. The cabin had sunk into a rhythm, quiet, but tense, like the eye of a storm waiting to remember it's still a storm. That morning, the rhythm broke. Hoofbeats. 3 sets, distant but sure, echoing across the canyon like the past announcing itself. Elijah was on the porch when they came into view, 3 men, riding hard from the south, dust kicking up around their horses' legs, faces hidden under wide brims and bandanas, spurs clinking like wind chimes made of bone. They didn't knock, just rode up bold and dismounted like the place still belonged to them. The leader, a tall man with a crow's nest of hair and a silver tooth that caught the morning light, grinned when he saw Cora step outside. "Heard Ada passed," he said, voice like cracked leather. "Thought we'd come pay respects." His companions fanned out. One leaned against the well pump, the other circled toward the barn, eyeing the goats with a butcher's gaze. Elijah tensed, hand tightening around the cane. Cora stood still, her face like stone, but the man stepped too close, reached out, and touched her chin with the back of his fingers. Didn't think the girl would grow up so. That was as far as he got before a low voice cut through the air like a saw blade on bone. "You're gonna ride out of here, now." The 3 men turned in unison toward the porch, where Elijah stood in the doorway, cane in one hand, his revolver in the other, reloaded now, oiled, familiar. His face was pale but steady, the kind of steadiness that came from a man who'd faced worse odds and buried them. The silver-tooth outlaw laughed, a dry rasp. "Who's the invalid?" he asked, eyes twinkling with mockery. One of the others drew iron, fast and stupid, but before the barrel rose even halfway, a sharp click echoed behind them. Cora stood 10 paces back, both hands braced on the stock of the double-barrel shotgun, muzzle aimed dead center at the man's spine. Her hands trembled, but the aim didn't waver. "Drop it," Elijah said without looking at her. And the outlaw hesitated, then let the pistol fall to the snow with a heavy thud. The leader raised both hands, grinning, but his eyes had gone cold. "We didn't mean no harm," he said, backing toward his horse. "Just passing through." Elijah didn't answer. Cora didn't lower the shotgun. The men mounted up slow, casting long glances behind them, and then they were gone, swallowed by the ridge, hoofbeats fading into the wind. Silence returned like a held breath released. Cora stood there for a long moment, then set the shotgun down slowly, the tremble in her, hands worsening now that the danger had passed. Elijah moved toward her, slow and stiff, and when he stopped at her side, he looked at her, not the weapon, not the men, but her. "You did good," he said. Just that. And in those 3 quiet words, something passed between them that neither snow nor time could bury. The pouch was small and worn, tucked beneath Elijah's bedroll where the boards creaked with every shift of weight, hidden not with fear, but with the kind of quiet reverence a man reserves for things he can't quite bury. Cora found it while sweeping, chasing dust and dried pine needles from corners the firelight didn't reach. Her hand brushed against leather, and she paused, frowning, then pulled the pouch free. It was heavier than it looked, the drawstring stiff from years of grime and sweat. She glanced toward the porch where Elijah sat with his back to her, whittling a piece of cedar into something unformed. He wouldn't hear her over the wind. With cautious fingers, she opened the pouch and poured its contents into her palm, and the breath left her like a gut punch. A tarnished star dropped into the light, scorched black along one edge, the letters U.S. Marshal barely legible beneath the soot. Dried blood marred its underside, not fresh, but unmistakably human. Her eyes flicked to the scar on his left palm, the same hand she'd seen clench around this pouch in fevered dreams, and suddenly, it made sense. Not a brand, not a wound from war or ranch work, but the kiss of fire, the bite of metal heated in rage. The badge had burned him, and he'd kept it anyway. She didn't go to him right away. Instead, she sat at the table for a long while, staring at that star like it might start speaking. When she finally stepped outside, the air was brittle with the sharp scent of snow and cedar shavings. Elijah looked up, his whittling knife still in hand, a half-carved bird in his lap. She held the badge out without a word. His eyes dropped to it, and for the first time since she'd known him, he didn't look angry or guarded, he just looked tired. "I wasn't always what I am now," he said, after a long pause. "That badge used to mean something. Meant I could make things right. That I was part of something decent." Cora didn't move, didn't interrupt. The wind tugged her braid over one shoulder. Elijah set the carving aside and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I had a daughter once," he said, voice low and uneven. "Bright as the damn Sunday, she used to braid wildflowers into her mother's hair and pretend she was a queen. When some men rode into our town, men I'd been tracking, I thought I could handle it. Thought I was fast enough. Smart enough. I wasn't." He looked at the badge in her hand again. "I buried them both. And when I tried to bring those bastards in, my own men told me to stand down. Politics, they said. Wrong jurisdiction. I threw the badge in the fire, tried to walk away from it all. But it followed me." Cora's fingers closed slowly around the star. "That's why you were out there," she said, barely above a whisper. He nodded. "Been running from justice ever since mine. Theirs, hell. Maybe even God's." The silence that followed wasn't cold. It was thick, like thawed ground before planting. She didn't speak again, just set the badge beside him on the porch rail and walked back into the cabin, the door creaking behind her. For the first time, she didn't see the outlaw bleeding in the dirt. She saw the man who'd stayed buried beneath him, just waiting for someone to dig. The thaw came slow, like the land itself was reluctant to let go of winter. But bit by bit, the snow receded, pulling back from the tree roots and fence posts until muddy earth peeked through, soaked and ready. Ice cracked in the creek like bones loosening after a long sleep, and the brittle silence that had settled over the cabin all winter began to lift. Cora rose earlier now, with sleeves rolled high and a seed sack slung over her shoulder, leaving boot prints in the soft ground as she worked long rows into the field where corn and beans might take hold again. Elijah, limping but steady, followed behind with a hoe, more awkward with tools than guns, but willing to try. They didn't talk much, not the way most folks do, but a rhythm settled in, words exchanged not in full sentences but in gestures and glances. He showed her how to plant her feet just so when aiming the rifle, how to breathe in through the nose and squeeze, not pull, the trigger. Her aim was already decent, but with him beside her, it sharpened to something lethal. In turn, she taught him to mend what he once would have thrown away: splintered fence rails, broken hinges, the sagging gate at the back of the barn. "Most things don't need replacing," she muttered once, hammering a nail with precision. "Just patience. Sometimes In the late afternoon, when the sky turned amber and the goats wandered near the edge of the tree line, they would sit side by side near the grave Ada now rested beneath. Elijah never said her name aloud, but his hat always came off when they sat there, held respectfully in his lap. And once, after a long stretch of silence, he left behind a sprig of wild sage without a word. Cora didn't mention it, but her eyes lingered. One evening, as the fire cracked low and shadows danced on the cabin walls, she broke the quiet between them. "Will you leave?" she asked. Her voice stripped bare of fear, just quiet curiosity, like someone asking if the rain was coming. Elijah didn't speak right away. He stared into the flames, jaw working, hands folded over his knees. Then, slow and deliberate, he reached across the small space between them and took her hand, calloused meeting, calloused, two lives worn at the same edges. He didn't grip it, didn't hold on like a promise, just let their hands rest together in the stillness for the length of a breath. And then, gently, he let go. "Not yet," he said. Just that. No explanations, no lies. The fire popped, and outside, somewhere in the dark, a bird began to sing for the first time in months. Neither of them moved. There was still hurt in them both, still ghosts that hadn't been named, still roads they'd yet to walk. But in that moment, with hands brushed and words spared, it was enough to know that not every man who wandered into your life came just to leave again, and not every girl left to fend for herself stayed alone forever. The wind that carried spring into the valley turned sharp again, not cold like winter, but urgent, like something riding on its back didn't belong here. Elijah noticed it in the stillness of the trees, in the nervous twitch of the goats, in the way Cora's eyes darted to the ridgeline every few minutes while hanging laundry. By dusk, the reason made itself known. A single rider, the one with the silver tooth, returned from that winter standoff, riding slow, lazy-like, as if the land itself owed him safe passage. He didn't dismount, just tossed a folded paper to the dirt at Cora's feet, tipped his hat, and rode off without a word. She didn't call after him, didn't touch the poster for a long time. When she finally picked it up, her hands trembled not with fear, but rage. Elijah's face stared up at her in black ink, years younger, cleaner shaven, but unmistakable. "Wanted," it read, "dead or alive." Below the print, a sheriff's seal from a place she didn't know, and a bounty that made her stomach turn. She took it inside and stuffed it into the wood box beneath the stove where they kept broken tools and rusted nails, things that should have been thrown out, but hadn't been. She didn't tell him. Not that night. Not the next. But secrets have a way of calling out to the people they belong to, and it was no surprise when Elijah found the poster 3 days later, digging for a hinge to fix the barn door. He stood there staring at it for a long time, lips pressed tight, then folded it once and set it on the table like something sacred. By the time Cora came in from the field, he was already packing a knife, his revolver, the leather pouch with the badge. His coat was folded neatly beside his saddlebag. She didn't ask what he was doing. Didn't need to. "You saved me once," he said without looking up. "That's enough. Don't lose yourself on account of me." His voice was steady, but something behind it cracked like thin ice. Cora stared at him, fists clenched, the red dirt still on her palms. "You think that's what this is?" she asked, voice low, almost dangerous. "Losing myself?" He finally looked at her, and she stepped forward. Fire in her eyes that hadn't been there when he first arrived, that hadn't even been there when she held a shotgun on 3 men. "I didn't ask for you," she said, each word like a struck nail. "Didn't want you bleeding on my floor. Didn't want to bury my mother alone. Didn't want to share bread with a man who won't look me in the eye when he says goodbye." Elijah opened his mouth, but she cut him off. "But I did all of it. And you're still here. Not because I'm weak, but because I decided you're worth it. So don't you dare take that choice away from me now." The silence between them burned. Finally, Elijah reached for her hand, not like before, soft and cautious, but firm, grounding. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, calloused against calloused. "Then we stand," he said, barely a whisper. "Whatever comes." Outside, the sky turned copper with the coming dusk, and from the ridge the call of a hawk pierced the air. Something was coming, and they both knew it. But for the first time, they would meet it together. The sun hadn't yet breached the ridge when Elijah saddled the old mare, its coat mottled with scars like his own, breath steaming in the chill that still clung to the valley. He moved quiet, careful not to wake Cora, though he'd left a note scrawled on the table in blocky script. Asterisk. Trust me to end what I started. Asterisk. He didn't take much, just his revolver, his knife, a flask of water, and the badge, tucked into his coat like a silent oath. By the time the sky began to pale, he was riding hard through the lower canyon, the wind in his face and the dust rising behind him like a warning flare. They were waiting 3 riders, one more than before, all with rifles slung lazy but eyes sharp, mouths curled in that mean way men wear when they think justice is just a coin flip and they've already bought the answer. Elijah didn't try to talk. He just led them deeper, into the narrows where the stone walls closed in and the shadows stretched long, where the echo of hooves made it impossible to count who was where. The ambush wasn't elegant, it didn't need to be. A rigged slide of boulders came down first, separating the outlaws from their escape, and then came the fire. Short, brutal bursts from behind cover, Elijah moving with ghostly precision, every step costing him blood, every shot landing with finality. 2 men fell in the first volley. The third tried to run, but Elijah was already there, his knife flashing once before both of them collapsed in the dirt, tangled in silence. He lay there after it ended, chest heaving, blood pooling beneath him, staring up at the orange-pink edge of a sky that looked too soft for a world this hard. He didn't hear her ride in, only felt her hands, sudden and shaking, pressing against his ribs, her voice cracking as she called his name over and over. Cora knelt beside him, hair wind-tossed, cheeks streaked with dirt and tears, her hands stained red as she fought to keep him tethered. "You said I did good," she whispered, voice barely audible through the wind. "Now let me finish it." Elijah looked up at her, the corners of his mouth twitching into a weak smile, the kind that belonged to a man who'd carried the weight of death and finally set it down. "You already did," he murmured, voice rasping like the wind through dry grass. The canyon was quiet again, save for the rustle of leaves and the slow breath of a man choosing, at last, not to die. Above them, the sun crested the ridge, flooding the rock walls with golden light, warming the earth, bleeding through the shadows like a promise. Cora leaned over him, her forehead resting against his, not crying now, just holding on, and Elijah, broken but still breathing, let his eyes close not in surrender, but in peace. And in that light, in that silence, the man who had once believed in nothing let himself believe in her, let himself believe in love, and let himself live.